Today on Deep Guild, we talk to radical polytheist Steven Dillon, author of the book Polytheism, A Platonic Approach. In the first half of the show, Steven will articulate his polytheistic theories, and later on, towards the end of the episode, we will discuss more practical matters. So let's light the bonfire.
Well, hello. My name is Steven Dillon. Thank you for having me on your channel. I'm just a regular polytheist guy. I'm in the Army currently, and for the last 10 years or so, I have been attempting to produce philosophical material on polytheism and paganism in general. I was kind of raised in philosophy in the analytic tradition, which has nothing to do with polytheism these days. So that's how my project started. I wanted to get these analytic philosophers to talk about this. I wanted them to turn their eyes and all their tools and innovation. That project was not successful. Nobody really bid it. The dominant topics in that field, as far as religion goes, is monotheism, atheism, particularly Christianity, very indirectly Islam, and even less so perhaps Judaism. But polytheism is not on the table. So in the wake of that,
Before you move on and explain what came out of your failure or the perceived failure, why do you think that is, just while we're at it, why do you think that is that people seem to have a hard time giving credence to a kind of polytheistic ontology as opposed to either an atheistic or a monotheistic one? Like, what's the deal? Why is polytheism or any kind of multicentricity or polycentricity, why does that seem to be kind of outside of people's ability to imagine?
That's a good question. Man, there's a lot to say to that. I think that there's a academic level and there's a social level. On an academic level, I think that the majority of philosophers and even theologians don't find the idea of polytheism all that interesting because it has this prima facie complexity to it and perhaps primitiveness. And that kind of bleeds into the social aspect. I think that socially speaking, nobody really is into this.
Well, hold on. Are you saying that there's no social allure to polytheism at all, or in academic circles? Because obviously, like, the idea of polytheism or paganism writ large is kind of gaining traction and becoming more of a thing. So are you saying just in these circles that you're trying to kind of entice into having this discussion? Or
Yes,
okay.
very much so. I think on a larger global and cultural scale, there's certainly a resurgence in practitioners and interests. And something I was thinking about as I was talking was even despite of what's going on in the ivory towers in every generation, there's a constant there's a continuity of paganisticity, you might say. People just naturally gravitate towards this pagan outlook, and they articulate it in different ways depending on what the overarching dominant worldview is at that time. But yes, from the academic standpoint, from these ivory towers, so to speak, I don't think that polytheism um, is safe right now. I think it's too complex. It's too against the grain, unfortunately.
Is this because when people try to imagine, I mean, it probably goes back to Duns Scotus or something, they try to imagine the highest thing, and they have in their minds this thing that they've inherited, whether socially or just this is how they see the world, as the higher up the chain of being you go, it has to end in a oneness, a singularity? Or is that like an implicit universal tendency of people in general, just either because how they were raised, or it might just be hard to imagine otherwise?
I think there's two things going on in that intuition, and I do think that the intuition is widespread. I believe it's sort of obvious and common sense for people that every process traces back. And when you think about everything in existence, the cosmos and all of the innumerable things going on, people naturally wonder what caused that, what caused that, what caused that. And in every culture and every religious ideology, from atheist to Christian to Sufi, it doesn't really matter. There's this intuition that things go back to some kind of singular source.
The Big Bang, as it were,
It could be,
like
yeah,
from a current year explanation for the universe, you always have to put causation into kind of metaphoric forms. It's probably an inappropriate metaphor because it's not like cosmo theorists would not say there was this huge explosion, which is what most commoners kind of think when they think of the Big Bang. But but regardless of that, we still think of a oneness. There has to be one start, one point at which these things from which everything derives.
exactly. Yeah, I think so. I think that is a common intuition. We all do tend to trace things back to one, but then in addition to that, we think of that oneness in relational terms, in comparison to other things, and we ask, is there anything else that's like that? We tend to picture like 2 points alongside of one another. And you mentioned Duns Scotus. He had a number of arguments about this, how there could not be multiple causes of the same effect. And he kind of typifies this thought pattern where we imagine a multiplicity of gods like as beings right next to each other, and we ask like, how can this committee of persons all be equally responsible for the same effect? And we have this way of
They're like a board of directors.
exactly, we have this tendency to think of that oneness that we got to in relational terms. So we start with that oneness, and then we ask, well, what's related to that? Is there anything surrounding it that's on like equal terms and stuff? And I think when we drop that auxiliary hypothesis, we stop thinking in relational terms. Once you get to that oneness, drop all relation, you can no longer say that this one is the only one because it's not related to anything. You can't
Right.
say it's one of many, you know?
Actually, that reminds me of a quote. Monotheism is either trivially compatible with polytheism or it is materially equivalent to atheism.
Yes, absolutely. Just to tie that in with what I was saying, there's a tendency in philosophy nowadays, actually for quite some time, to define a deity in relational terms. So we think of a god as omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, all good. That's how we define a god. But really, that's not the definition of the god. That's the definition of that god in relation to everything else. In relation to everything else, that God is all powerful, all knowing, these
Right.
things. So at that level of discourse, we've not yet considered what that God is in and of itself. We're still thinking of it in terms of everything else. How does it relate to everything else? How does everything relate to it? And so what I'm suggesting here is we once we reach that level, we push beyond it and we ask what is a God in and of itself, apart from everything else.
Right.
Whether it's knowing, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whatever, what is it? And I think when you do that, when you push the discourse all the way back to the beginning like that, you realize something. Without relational terms, you can't say that something, you can't quantify it. You can't say that it is the only member of a
Mm-hmm.
species. You can't say it's the only of this, that, the other. You can't say that it's one of many. So at that level of discourse, what we typically think of as monotheism and polytheism
Mm-hmm.
become incoherent or out of place.
Right.
We can't speak in relational terms. There's nothing else there but that thing. And so what we have at that point is this is where it gets crazy. This is what I call radical polytheism. It's because when you get to that point where there's no relational terms to understand it, all we can say is the thing itself. To go back to that point where like everybody seems to intuit that things go back to a oneness,
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing is we're seeing that there's we're tracing it back formally to this placeholder, but the content of that placeholder isn't exclusively any particular one. So we know
Mm.
that traces back to a one, but which one it is,
Which
there's
one?
no way
Yeah.
to. So the problem with atheism or the problem with monotheism, I think, is that in saying that there is only one God, it quantifies deity, and so it says that what it's calling as God is capable of being limited by number. It belongs to a category as the only member. And in belonging to a category, there is something more ultimate than it, the thing that it instantiates, the divine nature, the divine properties, whatever it is. It's the sole bearer of something greater than itself. And so
Mm-hmm.
in contracting divinity to a singular one, monotheism implicitly removes divinity, because it's saying that I'm going to call this God, but really it doesn't transcend
Mm-hmm.
nature. So it's part of nature just like everything else.
The monotheist, in my view, tends to see the God as being this transcendent being with no qualities, no properties. He's just ineffable, beyond all. Um, and I think that's what a lot of pagans like about their pantheon, is that they're a little bit more like, you read the Iliad or something, and these gods are they're more like almost more human. They're and full of passions. Like, do you think that polytheism, as being a pantheon of gods, each having their own jurisdiction and therefore having qualities, and does that intrude upon their ability to be God or not?
I think that the key takeaway for my vision of polytheism is that a god can have qualities. A god can be said to have all kinds of things, but
Mm.
the key is to say it's never just that. So there's always some leftover remainder piece that is uncapturable or irreducible to description. So, we could attribute to Poseidon all different kinds of things and inclinations and, you know, all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, I would say what makes him divine is that there's he's irreducible to all of those. At the end of the day, he is intrinsically himself, ineffable. And whatever we stack on, whatever features he carries with him at different levels of reality, he's never restricted to those levels of reality. He's always bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes from the sensible to the intellectual. He's that I think that's what makes something divine, strictly speaking. Because I know that term can be used in a lot of different ways, but in this technical sense, I think that to be a god is to be uncapturable by the categories. Even if
Okay.
you're in the categories, you can be in them. You just can't be just them, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
It reminds me, I don't know why, but there's this echo that I'm getting from in Hegel's preface to his Phenomenology of Spirit. There's a line where he says something like, if we say all animals, that's not the same as a zoology. All animals is like, is trying to capture a certain, enormous science into two words, all animals. But a zoology is all knowledge about those animals. But even that, I mean, in my mind, is like, it's still limited, because all animals are not just a zoology. It's like, animals are more than just what humans, scientists say about them and have discovered about them. Animals are a thing in process and in becoming and being, and they they kill and they eat, and they have actual lives. They're alive. So when we say God, we or a God, um, it seems so divorced from what we're actually talking about. We try to encapsulate this this thing that's beyond encapsulation into a God, two words. and it's not even a theology. It's not even everything we could say about a God. It's like this living thing existing beyond um, our ability to describe it. And I mean, obviously, a lot of things are like that. I mean, I just said that about animals, and animals are not gods.
I think just to tie all this in with our earlier discussion on monotheism, it seems to me that if you were to ask me, are the gods physical? I would say yes. And if you said, are they immaterial? I would say yes. And if you said, are they mental? I'd say yes. And you'd say, I could say yes to
Right,
all
right.
these things because they're never just that.
Yeah.
But the monotheist can't say that because the monotheist, it seems to me anyway, from my scheme of things, they don't posit a deity at the level that I do. Theirs is still a part of nature. And as such, it's sort of like another thing amongst all other things. And so this particular thing that they're talking about, it can't be physical and non-physical because those are two contraries. It would destroy itself.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
whereas for me, I think a God is all things, and on each level you can see that God. What does Zeus look like in the material world? Well, that's one thing. What does he look like in the psychical world? That's another thing. What does he look like in the intellectual world? Um, so I think there's this really interesting esotericism that polytheism brings to the world, where there's always something more. There's these occult properties to things because
Mm.
things are never just the way they seem.
Yeah, I was wondering, just to switch gears a little bit, what was it exactly that got you on this path? Um, were you ever otherwise inclined? Did you have a religion before or no religion, and you kind of went down this road?
I was raised Roman Catholic, and I was going to become a priest. I went to
Oh wow!
seminary. My older brother actually became a priest, so he went through the whole
Okay.
thing. I was in seminary with him though, and it was a lot happened in a little amount of time. But essentially, I was introduced to philosophy for the first time, and I began to rethink some of the things that I had taken for granted, and like a series of dominoes, one by one, I feel like my worldview just kind of started to fall apart. Not necessarily because I had any profound insights or original arguments against Roman Catholicism or Christianity, but
Mm.
just the fact that I had never really worked through these things. I never shown my work before, so to speak.
Right.
And so I left Catholicism, I left Christianity, and I spent a certain amount of time just questioning where to start. Like, what do we live forever? Is death the end of things? I really
Yeah.
started to become vulnerable to the big questions of life instead of deferring to some expert somewhere. And in the process, I that is where I was sort of baptized by the analytic philosophers, and I read Graham Oppy and William Lane Craig and all these thinkers who debate this for years. Is there a God? Has he revealed himself and so forth? I realized that nobody was talking about polytheism at all. And I
Right.
just
Right.
thought, this is really weird because
Mm.
this was the world's largest and oldest religious orientation. Like,
Yes,
how
of
is this
course.
not?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So, but from my profoundly ignorant standpoint, I tried to reinvent the wheel, and I thought I had come upon something. I didn't even know about the Neoplatonists,
Oh wow.
and so I came at this from a very strange angle where I was like, I found something. And years afterwards, I discovered that there were polytheists all along, and they had this rich tradition, like insanely um, more
Right.
profound than whatever I found.
So this question is leading in a particular direction. Now that you've kind of created this, I mean, it's not a new path because paganism and polytheism has been done before and has a long history. But because you have this sense of that you're making this path for yourself, or at least you have had that sense. Like now that you have a family and you have kids, and I have kids too, and we kind of discussed this before we actually start recording, but like till now we've been talking about these kind of abstract philosophical concepts like puzzles, solving puzzles. But where the rubber hits the road, you actually have to deliver like a belief system or something or some kind of system to your family, or do you? I mean, do you feel like there's more of a incentive for you as a polytheist, as a pagan, now that you have a family, to kind of really uh, articulate or encapsulate a system for your family? Do you feel like that's making all this more poignant, more urgent?
Yes, that's a great question. I have 4 kids. I just had
Wait,
two.
wait, you do? I have
I have
four
four
too.
kids.
I also have four.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's kind of interesting because they have seen me develop my ideas, and I'm kind of the kooky dad because I'm a philosopher and I'm always asking them weird questions about life and stuff. But I do feel a importance to delivering them a belief system. Here's what I'll say. I feel that there is an interesting friction, confrontation in me between my polytheism, my paganism that I've come to the conclusion of, and the culture that I was raised in here in America, which, from my mind, is overly like the overculture is secular. And from that secular perspective, what we're supposed to do is tell our kids that nobody knows the answers. You need to go find this for yourself. And so what it does is it preaches a sort of agnosticism,
right.
and
But also
it
that you have,
discourages.
sorry, that imperative that you have to discover it for yourself also aligns with American focus on individuality. Everyone's out there kind of doing it for themselves. Everyone seeks it for themselves, but in a way that kind of, I mean, I understand that as an American value, but there's something sad and kind of there's also something very problematic about a belief system that can't be shared collectively. And
Yes.
when everyone's kind of making it up as they go along, then we become these atomized, depressed individuals staring at their phones all the time. You know what I mean?
So when I do approach the subject with them, I feel this pressure from the way I was raised to not give them any definitive answers
Me
and so forth.
too. Yeah.
But what I honestly think and what I do realistically is I tell them whatever I think is true, whatever I believe to be true, and I give them my reasons for it. I don't sell it short. I don't pitch it any other way. I tell them what I think is true. And so with religion, I tell them confidently as I am that polytheism is true. And at the same time, I encourage them to think freely and I teach them
Yeah.
logic. I mean, I've written several manuscripts on logic, and I'm not I'm not trying to brainwash them in any sense, but it's to me it's sad that we even have to have that conversation nowadays. That people are uncomfortable to share their traditions, their religious traditions, with their kids. I think it's good to raise them,
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
like I said, I encourage them to think for themselves. You know, that's kind of the mantra that modern Americans have. But at the same
yeah,
time, I mean, only within reason. I was
yeah, of course,
at the same time, I feel like it's my duty as a father, not to be old fashioned, but to kind of set down a clear path for them, and they can choose to be on it or not. I'm not just going to say, "Oh, I'm not going to set down a path for them because it's up to them." Like I'm going to say, "Okay, I've lived several decades in this world, and this is what I know, and this is what I feel, and this, like for instance, like everything's so scattered now. Like with the people are in their own little spaces with their phones, and I don't want to harp on the phone so much, but like, um, I want to institute some sense of decorum, like for instance at the dinner table. And this might sound like no big deal, but it's a first step in a religion where there's a place where there's something there's rules, there's a sense of decorum, a sense of reverence, no screens at the dinner table. We're going to have this moment together, and it's like baby steps towards some kind of religious system. But that's what I do. I don't know. Do you have anything that relates to that? Or
Certainly, I do say, no screens at the dinner
oh
table.
yeah,
I like to let them know that I like to let them know that I reserve time for them. I make time for them. I always tell them this: I don't have time for anybody. I make time for the people that matter to me.
yeah,
Because
that's great.
otherwise, I've got so much going on. But it's like when my son will ask me to go throw the football or something, and there are times where I have to tell him I can't. But there are times where I'll tell him, like, man, I have so much going on right now, but you know what? I'm going to make time for you. And I want him to know that. And so, like, at the dinner
Yeah,
table, I tell him, like, you can be on your phone whenever you want, but here, I want to
that's
talk to you about your day,
that's interesting. I have the exact same policy. That's really bizarre. I mean, maybe that is a common policy, but I'm pretty strict. I'm not a strict parent, but about that, I'm very strict. You know,
Sure. Yeah.
so
I want them to know that. And I think that's important, especially as a father. I mean, they're looking at me as dad. That's what they
mm,
call me. They call me dad, and
yeah.
they look to me to like provide guidance and direction. And I can't imagine being just as lost as them.
Now, someone I know is like she has a almost like an ideological parenting rule of thumb that is like the opposite of what we just described. Like she thinks it is wrong to kind of foist her worldview onto her child. Um, and so, like, when it's time to get dressed in the morning, she lets her daughter choose her wardrobe. Instead of like, for me, it's like, okay, put this on. And the child can choose to do it or not, but at least I'm like leading them in a particular direction. This person I know opens the closet and says, "Okay, you choose what you're going to wear." First of all, they didn't ask for that responsibility, and some children I think just want to be guided and don't have the capacity to just decide from the multiplicity of all the clothes in the closet. Sometimes it's not just convenient for a parent to take the reins and direct the child, but it helps the child. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely makes me think of experiences I've had, especially with my son, who I guess like any typical guy, he just throws something on. And I guess what I've learned in my experience is that I like to let him develop his own sense of fashion, but at the same
Hmm.
time, I'm never going to let him go out there looking homeless. You know what I mean? So I stop him a number of times, and I'm like, "What are you wearing, dude?" He's like, "What?" I'm like, "That does not match." And I go in there and I show him. You know, you gotta provide that. Um,
Like a standard.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree.
It shows them you love them, even though it might be tough to go through to like run that gauntlet where your parents are like, "That's not good enough. You look homeless. You need to you need to improve. You need to up your game when it comes to like putting your clothes on." And that might
Sure.
be uncomfortable for the kids, but I think it remind like those kinds of hoops they have to jump through. Just it doesn't sound. It just reminds them that you love them and you care for them. And as much as they might militate against those standards, I think it actually gives them comfort at the end of the day.
Earlier, you said I could plug my book. This is my older book, I guess.
Mhm.
Um,
So that's Polytheism, a Platonic Approach. Okay, that's good.
yes. Yeah. So this book outlines a limited Platonic attempt to understand polytheism. But I will say I'm working on a book right now which delves heavily into the themes we're talking about. And in
Hmm.
this new book, I'm going to argue that the world itself is pagan. And part of it is, I think, its foundational level resists singularity, kind of like how we talked. You can get to this formal placeholder, but it's occupied by any number of ones. And on the other hand, that the world is esoteric in the sense that there's always an ineffable remainder after
Right.
all the description you have and everything, which is true. These are all true descriptions and the sciences and everything, but there's always something left over that you just can't capture. So
Yeah. That's great.
thanks for having me on, and hopefully this is like the first one. Just keep coming back, and
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
thank you.